Nothing matters when you don't feel a part of something or you don't feel loved. We are ferociously self-reliant, meaning help resistant. Neglect is all about what's missing, about what did not happen. What is this experience of nothing? I decided to do a one-day workshop for male partners of women who had been sexually abused as children. That group became a living laboratory where I began to study about neglect. I've seen so many couples who have seen numerous couples therapists, and no therapist ever asked them about their sexual relationship. Please educate yourself so that you can get help for yourself as well as helping the others. Nothing is something, and nothing matters.
Today, I'm really grateful to be sitting with Ruth Cohn. I'm just taking in Ruth. She spent decades helping us see something most of the field overlooked: the trauma of what didn't happen, the love that wasn't mirrored, the attunement that never came, the emotional nourishment that simply wasn't there. And when we first encountered her work on neglect-informed psychotherapy, it felt like someone had quietly turned on a light in a room that most of us didn't even know was dark. And I still remember, Ruth, the first time I met you in our studio in Boulder. You're small in stature. In fact, you remind me of my grandmother, Thelma. And I just realized this morning it's Thelma Cohen. So maybe we'll relate it.
I'm sure we're all cousins, Brian.
But the moment we turned the cameras on, it was unmistakable. You know, there was a force that you have, a clarity, a conviction, a message that felt bigger than the room that Ace and I both experienced. And I just appreciate your mission to make the world neglect informed, which I'm sure Ruth will talk about. So I'd love to explore not only what you discovered about neglect, but how you came to see it so clearly. So I know you've got lots of thoughts today, but maybe just start out, like, what first drew you to the field of psychotherapy? And how did your early experience focus on trauma, relationship, and sexuality?
Okay, it's a kind of a circuitous path. And I was thinking back to my early life, because my parents were both survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. And whenever I tell anybody this now, I always say, believe me, that does not shape my attitudes and my views about what's happening now. But it was an important factor in my development. So I always like to mention it because I grew up in this world that suffering was a fact of life. And I was born in California, but we moved to New York when I was 2, and we lived in an apartment building, and everyone in that building had numbers on their arm. They were all survivors also. So I was in this field, this world of suffering survivors, and that was the kind of the petri dish that I grew in. And I remember when I was really young, I was thinking about that this morning. The first song I remember my mother singing to us when we were kids was, "Lay down your sword and shield down by the riverside. Ain't gonna study war no more." It was this strong justice message, all from the beginning. And I remember my mother had 3 record albums: Pete Seeger, Harry Belafonte, and Burl Ives. Those were the only 3 albums we had. So it was this atmosphere where suffering and justice were like the air that we breathed. And suffering was a big part of it because, you know, my parents were both really traumatized. I was born in 1955. The war ended in 1945. So they were very, fresh from trauma and unrecovered, and there was a lot of bad things that happened in our family because they were traumatized people who had not been helped. So I was on the receiving end of a lot of trauma and neglect, as well as being on the receiving end of the intergenerational transmission of trauma and neglect. And that was what I was born into. And so I started growing up, and I remember when I was really young, my mother had this bumper sticker that said, "No war toys." And even though we didn't have any brothers, she was really against kids playing with guns, and she was a pacifist, and she was always voting for the whoever that guy was that kept running for president and kept losing, um, Adlai Stevenson. And she was always really trying to get the Democrat who wanted peace to win the elections. And of course, they never did. Anyway, so I grew up in this context where there was a lot of intergenerational transmission. I had sexual abuse, I had neglect, I was anorexic, I became alcoholic. I had a lot of problems. And when I went to college, and I was sort of in the throes of my eating disorder and my drinking, and the first thing that happened when I went to college was September 11th, 1973, the coup in Chile, the violent overthrow of the democratically elected socialist government, and this far left, not far left, but far left by comparison, president won, and that was Allende. And then in 73, he was overthrown by this vicious military coup. And because I grew up in this atmosphere of trauma and social justice and peace and all that stuff, I had this strong social justice impulse, but I didn't want to do what my parents did because I was rebelling against my parents. So I got very far involved in very far left politics. And that was going to be my life's mission, that I was going to be a freedom fighter, I was going to be a revolutionary, I was going to go up in flames and die in glory as, the new Che Guevara in female form. But I had a nervous breakdown in the process. So I fell apart, and here I was in Chile all by myself, came back, fell apart, and my best friend said to me, "You got to go to therapy." And I said, "I do?" And she said, so she made a referral, and I didn't know what else to do. I really just wanted to die. So I went to therapy, and I went to therapy,
How old
and
were
I
you,
drank,
Ruth?
and I went to therapy, and I went to therapy, and that was my life. And until finally, after a while, she got me to stop drinking, and I kept going to therapy, and I started to get better. And after a while, I saw, oh, this stuff works. Maybe I should do this, because the bottom had fallen out of my life. I didn't know who I was or who I was going to be. And so I had this idea, well, maybe I can't change the whole world, but I can work with like one person or two people at a time and have an impact that way. So I went to graduate school, and as it happened, since I was, I had this history with eating disorders and with alcohol, I was really interested in the body. Here it was like the early 80s, and there was this very, very primordial developing somatics field. So I decided to make my major in graduate school somatic psychotherapy. So I studied somatics, and I studied psychology, and I got more and more interested in trauma because of my sexual abuse history. And in the process of working through my own history and getting better, I got really interested in working with sexual abuse trauma because in the 80s, it was starting to be talked about in the larger world. We'd had the women's movement of the 70s that was bringing to light the violence against women and children, and sexual abuse of women and children was really starting to get talked about. So that became my area of interest. Now, the PTSD diagnosis came into existence in 1980. In 1980, it hit the DSM. Before that, we didn't even have a category for post-traumatic stress. It came out of Vietnam War veterans, where the VA didn't know how to help them, so they started studying trauma, and then we got the PTSD diagnosis, and then little by little it got wider and included more than war trauma. It included abuse and violence against, women and children, and sexual abuse and rape, and all that started really growing in our field, and I was really interested in that. So I started in California, which is usually at the head of what's going on in the psychology field, or really in the world. It's usually kind of a trailblazer. There was no trauma community at all. So I had to travel all over to get any little bit of training. And I remember the first time I saw Bessel van der Kolk. It was in 1987 in this little hospital in Berkeley, Grand Rounds. He was this young guy. He was really cute. He looked kind of wet behind the ears. His tie was too tight. He looked like a little kid dressed up for church. And he had this strong Dutch accent. But I listened to him and I just thought, wow. And then I started following him around, and everywhere he was speaking, I would go if I could. So I was flying to Boston a lot because I wanted to learn about trauma. And I got more and more and more interested, and I got trained, and then I started, pretty soon my whole practice was sexually abused women who had been sexually abused as children. So from there, I'm getting to the part about neglect. It takes me a little while to get there. So a lot of the women in my practice, and I worked with survivor groups. At that time, I had two groups that both ran for 15 years consecutively. I mean, they didn't have the same people the whole time, but I ran two survivor groups, and I would hear women complain a lot about their partners. A lot of them were straight in those days. So a lot of them had male partners, and they were complaining about sex, and they were complaining about how their partner didn't get it about sex. There was not much to read. I wrote a book in 2010. Stacey Haynes had a book that came out in about sometime in the 90s about sex, but there wasn't much around for sexuality and sexual abuse healing in those days. And I had this brainy idea, well, maybe I will do support groups for partners of women who were sexually abused as children. So I could I decided to do a one-day workshop for male partners of women who had been sexually abused as children, because I wanted to make my male partners into better supports for my clients. So the first day, I had my first men's group for men's workshop for partners of survivors. Here I was in my little office with 8 men, and they were all really kind of good-looking, successful, pleasant, personable. There was one guy who was older. He was a professor. He'd written many books. There was one guy who was a physician. There was an engineer and an electrician and a pastor in a church. They were all really accomplished and really very pleasant and really friendly. And we went around the room, as you do in a one-day workshop, and I said, so tell us about yourself. And without exception, I went around this group, 8 men. They all answered the question by talking about their wives. And I thought, wow, I ask you about you, and you answer about somebody else. What is that? And I started to get more interested. And then the more we talked, I heard them saying how they take care of kids, they pay the therapy bills, they do all the shopping and cooking, the house is a mess, their partner goes to therapy and she can't function and she doesn't do much else. They never have sex, and they were getting very little back from these partners. And I didn't hear about all that from my clients. So I started thinking, what kind of a childhood would prepare people to tolerate a relationship where they get so little back? And they all, similarly, with the same kind of shrug like this, they would say, well, nothing happened to me. As if, I had a good childhood. My parents stayed married. They paid for my education. I had plenty of food. I went to good schools. I had plenty of clothing and shelter. Nothing happened to me. And they had no reason to feel bad, but they did. And a lot of them had this sort of sense of ennui, like nothing matters. And nothing matters when you're not connected. Nothing matters when you don't feel a part of something or you don't feel loved. I started getting interested in what is this experience of nothing? Because they all similarly used that word, and they also couldn't understand why they felt bad, and they felt shame about feeling bad, and they felt like it was their fault that they felt bad, but they felt bad. They were depressed, they were dissatisfied, they were hopeless, they were not happy, and they felt a lot of shame and guilt about it because from the outside, they have it all. So I became interested in that. And that was that group was in 1998. And it was a day long. At the end of the day, the men had really connected with each other and they seemed to have a lot in common. And I was really interested in what I was hearing. And at the end of the day, they said, well, can we have an ongoing group? And I said, okay. So we started to meet as an ongoing group. That group started meeting in 1998, and it finally ended in 2018. We met for 20 years, and they would not let me end the group. I kept saying, I'm getting too old to work this late at night. And they say, oh, please don't end the group. We'll pay you more. We'll have shorter sessions. We'll meet less frequently. Please don't end the group. And so we kept going until finally 2018, I had to end the group. But that group became a living laboratory where I began to study about neglect, and I started adding in the neuroscience and kind of superimposing the attachment theory and the neuroscience, and I started to develop this model, which first I called the neglect profile, where I started noticing the characteristics that seemed to be so repetitive in the people, where they all had these what I call the 3 Ps of neglect, which is their underfiring brain made for passivity, procrastination, and paralysis, where they had trouble initiating, they had trouble completing tasks, getting things done, following through, and the partners complained about that a lot. And I started learning what it is in the neuroscience and the attachment that results in this underfiring brain, that results in this impatience and this, a lot of them were misdiagnosed as having ADD or ADHD because the underfiring brain doesn't focus well, so it doesn't begin, follow through, and complete, certainly in the interpersonal. And the main area of difficulty is in the interpersonal. So, coming back to the question, how did I get to neglect? That's how I got there.
And I think it's really brilliant what you did, because I know at that time trauma was still such a new field, but trauma's through a lens of something that happened. But you saw, you had the wisdom to see the impact, the trauma when nothing happened, or
Trauma and
so
neglect
I just
is
want to say
all
how brilliant that was.
neglect is all about what's missing, about what did not happen. And that's why it's tricky to work with, and that's why I really want to teach people, because we're learning to construct narrative basically out of nothing. And we want to create a narrative because that's how we heal trauma, and yet we don't want to make up a story when we don't want to create a fiction. And some of us have been in the field long enough, like in the early 2000s when we had the false memory syndrome movement, where there was this backlash about sexual abuse, where suddenly parents and all kinds of people were basically accusing therapists and clients of fabricating sexual abuse stories. So we don't want to fabricate, we don't want to create fictions, but we want to help people construct their narrative and put together an understanding about, well, what didn't happen that's supposed to happen, and what did happen in ways that were really traumatic but not obvious. And so that's what I began to study. And that's where I'm really working now to understand more and more deeply about the neuroscience, because that really helps us to understand a lot about the psychology.
You have the tagline, Ruth, on your site, because nothing matters. It's
Yeah,
very powerful and paradoxical. How would you explain it to somebody hearing it for the first time?
I will.
Because
I
nothing
always
matters.
say, I always say nothing is not nothing. Nothing
Mm.
is something, and nothing matters. Because this nothing appears to be nothing, but it is so laden with essential things that are missing that it is anything but nothing. It is something, and it is something that matters a lot. So we have to study this nothing because it is so important.
Are there common signs of neglect trauma that slip under the
Oh,
radar
sure.
in like traditional therapy
Absolutely.
settings?
Absolutely. And the most glaring of them all, and this is what makes the survivors of neglect really hard to work with, is we are, because I'm certainly one as well, we are ferociously self-reliant, meaning help resistant. So the child of neglect is insistent because it was survival for them. There was no one else, so I had to do it all myself. And if I do it
Mm.
all myself, I'll be safe. And if I try and rely on somebody else, the chances are very good I'll be abandoned, rejected, forgotten, invisible. All the things that were their childhood experience is what they imagine will happen is if they attach and depend on another. So they create a life that is very, insular, very self-reliant, even though they have relationships. And this is why people like you and me and lots of helpers, help providers in professions, helping professions, are survivors of neglect, because one of the ways we learn how to attach safely is through caretaking. because you can be in close with people and they tell you all their problems and they love you and they need you, but you don't need them, not emotionally. Maybe you need the fee, maybe not, but you don't have emotional dependency ever again, because that is life threatening. That's why they need us, because their life is so lonely in the deepest way, and so they're stuck in this real struggle between wanting to attach and wanting to be safe. So the most glaring and the most obvious of traits is the self-reliance, and it shows up in the therapy because they don't want to need us. They don't want to need the therapist. So when you encounter a client who is really resistant to attaching, and sometimes they'll come in, you got a new client, and they're still seeing another therapist, and they figure, oh, I'll just see both of you. And I'll say, I don't think so. I mean, there are lots of reasons why you don't see more than one therapist, but especially with these clients, because they don't want to put all their eggs in one basket because it's too dangerous. So to answer your question, the self-reliance is the most glaring. And so they, of course, have problems with sex, because sexuality, you can do it all yourself, but it's not the same thing. To do it all yourself with sex, well, you can, but it's it's not it's not the same thing as having a partner. So a lot of them have sexual frustrations, or their partners do, and they have sexual problems, which I became a sex therapist in 2000 because I really wanted to study sexuality. And so now I've got a real joint specialization of sexuality and trauma and neglect, and also the confluence between them, because it's complicated, obviously. And I was on a mission for about 25 years to get the trauma field and the sexuality field to talk to each other a little bit more. And finally, we're starting to see that. And I wrote my book in 2010, or it came out in 2010, which was about the relationships and the sexual relationships between trauma and neglect survivors, and how complicated and challenging the sexual relationship is. And it's definitely due for an update, and I teach a lot about that.
So do you see that you can use sexuality to heal neglect wounds, part of the path?
Well, it can be. Sexuality tends to be kind of a more um, advanced work, because it's really delicate. And I mean, people in general are not inclined to talk about sex. Back when I got trained, and I don't think it's any better now, the requirement for master's level psychology license, the requirement of human sexuality back in the 90s, when I got licensed in 1990, was the requirement for human sexuality training to get licensed 4 hours. Most therapists, and I don't think it's changed. And some
Wow.
licenses, some states have no human sexuality requirement at all. So if you take the fact that sexuality, even though we're bombarded by titillation and advertising and objectification and sex everywhere, at the same time, there's a real poverty of information about it. People don't know about sex. People don't talk about sex. So many therapists never ask about sex. I've seen so many couples who have seen numerous couples therapists, and no therapist ever asked them about their sexual relationship. And the child of neglect, who never had anyone to ask or tell anyone anything to, they think they're supposed to know already. they think, oh, well, people aren't talking about it because it's natural, so everybody else knows the answer to their questions except me, but nobody's talking about it in the locker room or on Facebook in the ways that I'm not sure about. So a lot of these questions, people don't, people are ashamed or afraid to ask, and so nobody says anything. And so I'm really wanting to help therapists, if nothing else, learn how to talk about it, learn how to ask about it. And,
How do you begin those conversations, Ruth?
well, I'll just say, um, how,
I know we have a course on that too, but
well, yeah. And, once you get to know people and you're starting to ask them, you let them know, and people generally know when they come to me that sexuality is one of the things that I talk about. But I will
mm,
ask them, so how how is it between you? What is your sexual life like? And often there's a partner that's really complaining about something. With neglect, because of this real, what I call profound interpersonal ambivalence, and consciously or unconsciously, this real terror around true attachment, the capacity for intimacy is quite high in the sexual relationship. And so the terror factor, whether or not it's conscious, will be high in the sexual relationship. So, how do survivors of neglect resolve this? That is, what brings some people in, because what are some solutions, quote unquote, where you can be, sexually satisfied without being dependent? Well, here are some of the more common solutions I've encountered. Cybersex, where you have sex with an inanimate partner. So, no danger of dependency there, no danger of attachment there. Now we've got AI. I don't know what's going to happen in terms of AI and sexuality, but every new technology that's come along since the wheel has been utilized in the direction of sex. So you can bet the AI will be right in there if it isn't already. So cybersex is one. We've got infidelity, where I don't put all my eggs in one basket. I have my partner and I have whoever else on the side, and there may be more than one. Or I might have serial monogamies, where I stay with one person long enough to start to get attached, and then I move along because I can't afford to get dependent. Some people do that with therapists also, where I think of it as like a relay race, where you stay as long as you stay and then you pass the baton and you move on. Um, and sometimes we see serial infidelities where they kind of go from one to the next, or you see things like abstinence where they don't have sex at all. And the common thread that I found with my sexual abuse clients was, and this was one that's really complicated, and that is where they partner with someone who cannot or will not have sex with them. The survivor of childhood sexual abuse often fits that category. So they come into
mm,
therapy, and you've got the identified patient, the sexual abuse survivor, and you've got this partner that says, nothing happened to me, I'm just an endurer. And it's only when you really learn to recognize neglect that you realize that they bring half, 50% of the problem to the sexual impasse that they're experiencing. Half of it is because of their survivor, and half of it is because of this profound ambivalence that comes with neglect. So that's where I'm on a mission to neglect inform the world, because we have to learn how to recognize these people so that they don't sit idly by and not get any help. And so the other partner gets all the blame and all the help, and they're off the hook, but they don't get any help. And they continue to be invisible, unhelped, like they were in their families, like they are in our field for the most part, until we start recognizing and helping survivors of neglect. So that's what neglect-informed psychotherapy is all about, trying to make them visible and teaching our field how to help them.
What you're saying is so valuable because I feel our society is the narcissists are winning as far as all the noise on the media, social media, money, um, and it's the polarity of the people who've been neglected go even more invisible.
Yeah. And you know, Brian, you named something really, really important because neglect is about what did not happen. And when you talk about narcissism, and you're taking me back to this profoundly important issue of intergenerational transmission, because one of the most essential developmental experiences for infants starting at birth is the mirroring function, where I look up into the eyes of the beloved, longed for other, and I see a joyful, loving reflection of me. I look up into those eyes, I see a reflection of me, and that's what stimulates the very most primitive periaqueductal gray, the part of the brainstem that we have in common with the lizard and the frog and the dinosaurs, the reptilian brain. That's where the sense of self begins. When there's no mirroring, which with neglect there isn't, there is no development of self. And so all there is the gnawing need, and there is no other. So I'm all by myself with this gnawing need. So, how do you get narcissism? You get narcissism from the failure of mirroring. There's no mirroring, so there's no development of a sense of self, but there's only the ravenous need for other and nothing but me. So there's this me and my need, and I don't develop a sense of self, and I therefore don't develop any empathic capacity to feel for another, because there was no me, so there is no other, so there's only my need. And the need just blooms into narcissism. And so the intergenerational transmission of neglect, we get narcissism, and we get more neglect, and we get more narcissism, and we get more neglect, and then we have Elon Musk and people out in the world who are these flagrant narcissists that have such a huge impact on the world, and we have a proliferation of more trauma and therefore more neglect. And so that's where, and this is where I'm going to wrap up with you, Brian, that we have to work both sides. And this is where I'm really getting back to my roots, where we have to work macro and micro, because there's a feedback loop between the macro world level and the micro individual self level, and you get the intergenerational transmission of all of it that way. So we have to heal the world, we have to heal the individual, we have to find ways, we have to find each other and find ways to work both ends. And I have so much more to say, but I'm just going to hold there. And I didn't even give
That
you
was
any time to
awesome.
talk.
I kind of think of like my own neglect journey. Um, and I think of Ram Dass, you have to become somebody to be nobody. And my own spiritual path as a meditator, where there's it's going towards emptiness and clarity and compassion. But is that emptiness, like you have to have a self before you become a no self. in the same way for somebody who's been neglected. So it's a tricky
And you
math
have
in
to
the
have a
spiritual realm.
self before you have to have a self before there's an other. So it works both ways, because without a self there is no other, and there's also the, like you said, the impossibility of stepping back.
Well, I think what I've taken away listening to you, it's just a beautiful path of like your parents growing up with Woody Guthrie, wanting to be a social activist, and then going to Chile, and then going to therapy, and then you always had your eyes open. What I've listening to you today and knowing you for what's next, like bringing in the men's group, and like, oh, it's neglect. Like, I just really appreciate how open you are, and then you went into the research, like learning neuroscience. So I think you're such a great model for other
Mhm.
clinicians. Like
Thank you.
you have your path and you're open for new discoveries.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. And I'll say one last thing that's really important to me, and that is, because of this caretaking impulse, it's a safe way to connect that many neglect survivors find. You'll find many of your neglect clients are doctors, social workers, psychologists, some kind of helper. Many of them are us. And many people come to me after they hear me speak, and they've got these big eyes, and they say, "Oh my God, that's me." And it is many of us. It took a while for me to get it, that, oh, I'm not only a survivor of overt trauma, I'm also a survivor of this. Many of us are survivors of both. And so many of your people in your community that are watching this webinar will say, "Oh my God, that's me." And please educate yourself so that you can get help for yourself as well as helping the others. Because life can be really wonderful when we actually become able to receive help and depend on others and basically walk the walk. And it's a rough journey, because your dependency need was a survival need that was not met. So there is deep in our core this fear of dying, because that was our earliest experience. So I really encourage all of the people that might be listening today to avail yourself of material that will help you find your own healing. And when you're able to identify, and one of the guys in the men's group, he said, I remember this, it was so lovely. He said, "I want to get a placard, a disabled placard for my car that says child of neglect," because finally they had something to call it, something to call what they had been suffering from their whole lives. It's like, oh, yeah, and I'm not the only one.
Why is naming so powerful? Like I get it, but is it something in our system when we
It
know?
really
I don't want to
is.
say it's a
It's
diagnosis.
it's
Is it
affiliation,
being seen?
belonging, feeling like I'm not alone. Yeah.
And wrapping up, is there any advice you'd like to give clinicians, either understand how to
There's
neglect before they see their first client?
yeah. Um there are only two pieces of advice I ever give. I I'm not one for advice giving, and especially if it's not asked for, but you asked me. So these are the two
I
pieces of advice I ever give. One of them is about relationship, but it pertains to everything. And what I say about relationship, there's one non-negotiable in mate selection, just one. Find someone who's willing to work on the relationship, committed to working on the relationship, working their side of the street with therapy if necessary. Find someone who's willing to work on relationship. through the lifespan. If you've got that, you've got it made. If you don't have that, you probably don't. So that's my one piece of relationship advice. For therapists, and this I'm really committed to, it's the only success I've ever had in my life. All of my successes are based on this piece of advice. Get the best consultation money can buy. Tell them everything and do what you're told. And do your own work. You have to do your own work with this population, especially because so much of the communication in those rooms is nonverbal, because they have no story. So you'll pick it up in all these emotional, imaginal, in these ways that are other languages besides verbal. It's in the emotional, it's in the interaction. So you have to do your own work so you'll know the difference between your stuff and their stuff. Because if we don't know, we can't help them. If we get triggered in reaction to them, we can't help them.
Just being sensitive to the neglected partner.
Yes.
Because they're invisible and it looks like everything's okay and they're the victim.
That's right. Don't let them be invisible.
Any final words?
Just thank you so much. And I want to welcome people to have a look at my website if they want to. There's lots of free stuff. We have a mailing list, and I write a blog, and I make YouTube videos. And so there's lots of free material that people can help themselves to about all different aspects of trauma and neglect. Some of my material is starting to get translated into other languages, which is really exciting to me. So please help yourselves. There's a lot that's free.
Thank you so much, dear. And just so glad you haven't hid yourself in just making cheese and you're still out there doing this work.
I wish I had time to make cheese and bread as much as I'd like to, but it'll happen. I'll get back to it. Thank you, Brian. It's always a pleasure.
We really appreciate it. And thank you all for listening.
Yeah. Bye-bye.